guys, welcome to another episode. Today my guest is Matthew Heuman. Matthew is CEO and founder of Neuvote. This is one of those, topic that as election comes close that we always talk about it. And definitely, with my technology background, I'm always curious how these systems that, work and, with the state of where we have a confidence in the systems. Looking forward to learning from you, Matthew. Thank you so much for your time. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Gurmeet. It's a pleasure.
You're welcome. Let's talk about Neuvote. What it's about and what do you guys do? If you just walk us through our audience, what it's all about.
For sure. So Neuvote's primary business is providing online voting services to public elections. So governments at any level, but primarily at the municipal level across Canada right now.
I see. So, talk about your little background, Matthew. How does somebody inspire to run a technology business? How do you get into it? What's your background? How do you end up building the systems?
Yeah, it's an interesting vertical to get into. I think I've spoken to a number of other founders of online voting companies, and typically the thread that binds us all is we always want to solve a difficult challenge, which is providing online voting. It's one of the more challenging technologies because of the way that the system is built, and not only that, but the provisions and requirements that elections typically have, secrecy, anonymity, etc. So it's a really interesting technological challenge. How I got brought into it was sort of like the weird thread of my life myself, and my background is cybersecurity. My father was a cybersecurity engineer who deployed IT systems for governments. And so I kind of grew up around the principles of secure data and building, secure systems just from the work that we did together. And it wasn't, to be honest, I didn't even think I would get into a technology company. My real passion was to provide journalism services. And so I kind of applied the cybersecurity principles to journalism. Basically, how to hide data and get stories out of conflict zones was my original sort of thesis in life. And the application of that same security is very apropos to voting as well, because at the end of the day, an election has to occur completely in secret and completely securely without interference from any actor, including a state government or a state actor. So this weird culmination of technology and passion really emerged when I was in university. And there was the 2015 election was called, and essentially Elections Canada was sort of restrained from promoting voting services other than facilitating the election. A lot of the initiatives that they had planned out were no longer applicable to them. And so I decided to step in and build an application called Neuvote in 2015 that would provide information and services to voters across Canada for the 2015 federal election. It was a really great project, picked up a little bit of steam, got some press. It was really fun project to run in university. The thing that kind of pulled me into online voting was when I released that application. It was called Neuvote, and it was an app. So I received emails from across the country asking, can you vote online? Is this a voting system? And of course I'm like, you can't vote online. I had to, Elections Canada actually called me into their office and said, you have to put a disclaimer on your app stating that this is unofficial and not a voting application, etc. More than happy to do that. And, but the feedback that we got from Canadians was that online voting was really, really wanted. It was something that the general public really, really wanted to get a hold of. At the same time, which was really interesting to us, the Liberal Party, their platform for the 2015 election was that they would start looking into online voting. And it became part of their public policy. And so we saw those two sort of shifts happening where the public was wanting it, the government was sort of agreeable to it. And we decided, after the election concluded and, the Liberals won, we decided to, double down and start looking at the real challenges facing online voting. Really, why is this technology not available to the mass market? And after years of research, we realized how challenging this really was. It's exceptionally challenging, probably one of the more difficult applications of digitization in technology in one of the services that we use fairly, regularly. Banking is easy to do. If you have a transaction that goes to the wrong person, you can audit it. You can check where the recipient is, make sure it's a legible a transaction. With voting, though, you're talking about a voter who has to be verified 100%, passing a secure packet of information that's encrypted completely to a recipient service somewhere that can't be hacked. And so we started looking at realistically like how to do this. And what we saw from the market that was currently available for online voting, the major challenges were identifying a voter in an effective way. But the primary one was data security. How do you ensure that digital ballot box is unhackable and not tampered with? And that's where things really, really got interesting for us. And that's kind of how the company sort of emerged, because we, developed a hypothesis. We started scoping it out and working on the technology. So that's kind of how I got pulled into it. It was sort of like, I didn't intend to do it. It was sort of just this thing that sparked off in university, but typically that's how life goes sometimes.
Interesting. So let's talk about some of those technology challenges. One you mentioned is data security. Is that the only challenge has been, or also communication between devices and back into your servers as well? I saw you on your site that everything's encrypted on a user side, on a system side. You guys use fairly, no matter what transfer, everything's encrypted data. So where's been challenges on your sites, or is it between communication devices? The data transfer from one device to your systems, communication in between. So where's been some of those technical challenges? If you talk a little bit more on those.
Yeah, to be honest, every aspect of the service has to be secure. And so, like, as you mentioned, you're talking about client-side security, you're talking about server-side security, data in transit encryption, data at rest encryption. Pretty much the entire thing is a vulnerability that needs to be patched. And for an election, because of the way elections are ran, again, it's very difficult to audit an election in general. To audit a digital election is monumentous. It's very, very significant. So every aspect of the service had to be reviewed and thought of as essentially a bullseye that somebody was going to be aiming for. And when we started looking at the feasibility of everything, the bullseye became a target for not, general people to tinker with in their basement, or people, to play with the service or whatever. We're talking like the threat actors or the threat matrices were state actors, governments that have unlimited, unknowable resources to point at this thing. And we saw this really culminate over the last few election cycles in the US, where state actors were targeting systems for attack, and it became significant. So our original hypothesis was, funny enough, like regarding the data security aspect, was keep paper as a core component of the voting system. Simply think of it as a transaction that occurs. It's sort of like a reverse of scanning a document. You're taking a digital artifact or a digital input and changing it into an analog output. And once that analog output is encoded, which is marked by the voter, it's off the network, meaning there is no more vulnerability. There's no server sitting somewhere to be manipulated. It's treated in the same respect as in-person voting, where you go in, you throw a piece of paper into a ballot box and call it a day. That was our original methodology. But more to your point, the core aspects of the infrastructure had to be secured as well. So over the years, this has been probably a 4 or 5 year R&D project primarily, simply because as the technology shifted and grew, and we found more vulnerabilities and more things that needed to be patched, we realized that we really needed to pull together a significant group of technologies to facilitate this in a way that was going to be capable of actually doing an election. And so that's what we've been doing. We've been pulling together a number of very, very great partners who provide a particular element that then provides the core functionality of the online voting system. So this isn't a solo venture by any means. This is definitely something that we needed help with. We wouldn't even pretend to be able, and I don't think any company would be able to pretend to be able to pull something like this off individually. We simply like I said, spent 4 or 5 years R&Ding this, talking to experts all across the world about how to do this successfully, understanding where the criticisms and the challenges facing online voting were, and then trying our best to develop a solution that would eventually satisfy those critics.
Mm-hmm. I know we're scrutinizing security on a digital system, on your voting system, but if you compare that with the previous, paper voting, there's a risk also involved in that when you go in person and vote. And I would assume that, since you've gone through all the checks and balances, it's more risk left on a paper side than simply in digital side. Where is those comparison, that pros and cons in a vote system? What are your thoughts on those, Matthew?
Well, it's really interesting because like this, due to the nature of the significance of this, it's a core element of society and how we function in a democracy. There is a ton of research and people looking at this from all aspects. And so, funny enough, just a quick background of the market, Canada is the largest user of online voting globally. A lot of people don't realize it, but it's the fact, right? Like everyone points to Estonia as typically the vanguard of online voting in the world because they do it every election across, and it's completely online, completely digital. And it complements their whole e-government services anyway. But Canada per capita is actually the largest user because we have more people. Estonia is a very small country. It's a very homogenous country. Canada is very diverse. It's very big. And in Ontario, particularly, online voting has been used since 2003. And there are cities like Markham, for example, that have essentially become their own vanguard of online voting inside of Canada, and sort of as the pinnacle of online voting deployment in North America. So it's really taken off, and we've seen exponential growth, election cycle after election cycle, in Ontario of municipalities that are ready to adopt this. In fact, Toronto in 2013 was looking at it. They were looking at procuring it for their own election, and unfortunately, the technology at the time just wasn't ready to go to something of that significance. It wasn't able to stand up to the scrutiny that was put towards it. But because of COVID, especially in the upcoming elections for 2022, we are seeing mass adoption. And I would easily forecast the majority of cities in Ontario will be using some form of online services for their election easily. So it's very, very interesting on that regard.
Interesting. So from user standpoint, from consumer standpoint, this, makes it much easier for people to go out and vote, right? So if you can do that from your mobile device, you don't have to go out, in a school or community center and go out and vote. It makes life much simpler. Would there be, a lot more benefit from consumer side? Like people should be asking for it. Hey, listen, how can I just securely vote from home? I don't have to go out, and you have to make a different time zones. You can vote any time of the day just from the devices. It makes life much easier.
Markham is a great example of this. Like they released their statistics again, because they've been doing it for so long. They were the first city in North America to do it. They've been issuing reports and case studies based on their experience with online voting dating back years and years. And currently, like the majority of their voters vote online, and they're very satisfied with the voters are very satisfied with how the service runs for them. In a city like Markham, where you have, this gap between the core Toronto zone and then the outskirts of Markham. If you work in Toronto, the idea of leaving Toronto to get, core Toronto to get to Markham to vote, if anyone's been on the 401, they would understand how difficult that could be. So for the voters' experience, it's phenomenal, and we've seen pretty much a general high level of satisfaction across Ontario, or pretty much anyone who's used online voting, simply for the convenience play. The real criticism and challenges are coming from more the academic and cybersecurity side, as people really look into this. And we were talking about earlier about like what do the critics say. The CSC is the Canadian Security Establishment. So they're like the equivalent to the NSA of Canada. They've released their own studies regarding online voting, and even they agree that a simple software-based solution probably isn't going to cut it, because of you're talking about zero-day exploits, vulnerabilities that are completely unknown to the general public at the time, that could attack a system like this. And no company is completely bulletproof. Microsoft gets hacked regularly. Google has their own issues. they patch them and they can work through them. But when it comes to an election, because of the significance of it, because of the repercussions that can affect society if an election gets interfered with, the general consensus is that we shouldn't be moving elections online. The paper system is generally better. To the point you were making earlier, there is a vulnerability about the paper side as well, but it works. We've been using it for a long time. So if it's not broke, don't fix it kind of thing. But I think in general, the way we're moving forward now, and we've seen this in numerous elections across North America, it's not as easy anymore. People have a very different way of living. They have different expectations for how governments provide services. And I think voting it's coming to a head now, where voting is going to have to make this sort of digitization jump.
Is there enough, back to the building of confidence into the system, is there enough a process or strategy built in that is easily auditable? Can you audit to the very down level to confirm the validity of the votes, that this is what it was costing? Because not only a technical, but sometimes it could be political challenges when somebody challenges somebody, right? So do we have enough process built in that we can audit the system and backlog in it? Listen, this is what the voting was, to verify it.
Yeah, my personal belief is that when it comes down to a very high profile election where the auditability and transparency is paramount, paper is generally going to be a good fallback. There's the 2020 election in the US, for example.
Yeah.
The most audited election in US history. The provider, the service provider that was audited to that level was Dominion Voting Systems. Funny enough, a Canadian company.
Yeah.
Dominion's CEO was in the Globe and Mail, talking about why his company wasn't responsible. And my personal belief, just to be very clear, is I don't think Dominion did a single thing wrong. In fact, I think they did a phenomenal job of providing the services down to the US. And the criticism levied against them is completely unfounded. But his statement was that paper is king. Paper is what he says is the gold standard of election security. I tailor that belief as well. I definitely believe that at its root level, if you need to audit an election, if you have to count them out by hand, which they did, millions of ballots in the US, that's what it comes down to. Well, that's how you know that there's assurances built into the system. When it comes to the digital aspect of it, though, where we saw a real benefit was in some technology that has emerged very recently. So there's a service that we've adopted called Election Guard from Microsoft. And this service, to learn the history of it, is phenomenal. So originally it came out of a research thesis from Dr. Josh Benelow, who was understudy, I believe he was a student of Ron Rivest, the R in RSA encryption. So this is not something that was kind of thrown together. The thesis and the work that was, eventually became Election Guard was from the 80s. This isn't a new technology or a nascent technology. This is something that's been really thought about for a very long time. How to apply digital cryptography to elections to secure votes. And what Election Guard has produced now is something called end-to-end verifiability, which is a cryptographic protocol that allows a vote to be recorded as cast as intended, recorded as cast, and then tabulated as recorded. And what that means is the voter casts their vote. It's cryptographically sealed using the homomorphic encryption. Okay. It is recorded in the system as sound, the system records the vote as the voter intended. And it all, again, the math behind it is quite significant. And then the tabulation of those votes is then verified using the same cryptography that followed through the chain of custody. And it produces a result where not only do you have transparency in the audit, the ability to ensure that everything happened accurately, but you also have the verifiability for the voter, where the voter can then check their ballot and ensure that their ballot was counted by the system accurately, but in the same way, not reveal who they voted for. So you, Gurmeet, could cast your vote, ensure that your vote was counted. You could run a verifier against the system to make sure that the source code itself was running effectively. But at the same time, you couldn't produce a receipt or a record of who you voted for. So nobody could coerce you or try to get you to sell your vote or something like that, because it wouldn't work. And that was, again, a huge problem in online voting. And it's something that we've seen in the Ontario market is people, family members, etc., casting votes on behalf of someone else, which
Mhm.
is, of course, violates the tenets of the election.
Mhm.
So what Microsoft has done, to their credit, like, this is a free open source SDK that they've released. I couldn't tell you why they decided to do it, but they've produced something that I fully believe is going to change the way that elections are handled. I think
Mhm.
the gold standard for election security moving forward is going to be the election guard receipt, where
Mhm.
you are able to check that your vote was counted accurately, and anyone who contests the election will be able to verify that the election itself was handled accurately as well.
Very interesting. Yeah, if you can validate it that way, you can work backward and decrypt all the messages and get that validity. I mean, that makes a huge sense. So technical challenges, as you mentioned, that yeah, you guys already figured out, you guys already worked at it and dealt with most of the challenges. How about communication side of things? Now you have to explain that to the public as well. Also, you have to explain that to election officials. How big is that big challenge, that communicating to them and building that trust based on the communication and policies and going back to them? How big is that challenge has been?
That is that's the mountain. The public perception, and not only that, but dealing with the election officials is it's diverse, right? Because, like, the election officials are they're municipal workers, they're government workers. They're not coming from a technical background. A lot of them, to their credit, though, have put a ton of their own time to research and understand this technology. And particularly in Ontario, because they're adopting it so quickly, they've done their research. They've hosted their own sessions where they brought in different vendors to talk about the technology.
Mhm.
We've done our own seminars where we brought in the Microsoft team to talk about the technology to the vendors. And you're seeing now a lot of people sort of get a better understanding of what these technologies can do, where the deficiencies are. And in the RFPs, in the actual procurement documents that we've seen, they are top level. Like, they are very, very significant,
Mhm.
asking the right questions that you would expect a technology advocate to really be probing into, regarding failover, redundancy, how to set up an on-prem server, how to set up a cloud-based server, the
Mhm.
security parameters and security testing that would have to go into something like this. It's actually kind of refreshing to see the government take such a proactive approach for something so mission critical as high cybersecurity integrity systems.
Mhm.
It's very, very interesting to see how the government is quickly adopting these principles, bringing in their own experts
Mhm.
as sort of consultants to get them a better understanding as well.
Mhm.
It's phenomenal market right now, and it's the most exciting exciting market I've ever had pleasure of being involved in, that
Right.
is sort of underneath everything. Like, most of the voters probably don't know what kind of work or the level of work that these clerks are putting into,
Mhm.
simply to allow them to go on their browser and cast a vote come election day. It's a
Yeah.
huge uplift.
Yeah. The normal consumer don't have no idea what's behind the scene, right? Um, these ransomwares and all this cyber attacks and all that stuff happens in a market. Does that does that increase more confusion or more people's being hesitant to use some of those systems? That those incidents happen outside. Do they cause a little bit more issues on your side?
It's interesting, because those are real threats, and there are cities in Ontario that have been victims of ransomware attacks.
Mm-hmm.
And for the public perception, I couldn't tell you. Like, I don't have any data to measure the public's regard for ransomware versus the feasibility of online voting. But what I
Mm-hmm.
can say is the clerks themselves, like the municipal workers, are paying attention to it, and they are taking it quite seriously, due to the fact that we've had some major disruptions in cities across the U.S. I think Atlanta was a huge one, where their whole IT system got hacked. And it's I actually prefer that it get brought to light so that we can address these issues.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to cybersecurity, you generally want to take a proactive approach versus a reactive one. Because if
Mm-hmm.
you're reacting, you're already hacked, there's already vulnerabilities, your systems are already offline. Whereas proactiveness provides you the ability to start patching things in advance, or understanding how to mitigate against them better than
Mm-hmm.
ahead of time. So for when we see these conferences where the municipal workers are actually learning about ransomware, how to address it, how to mitigate against it, it's more refreshing to me to see that than for them to be more discounting it, like, oh, we're a small town, it's never going to happen to us. When it comes to these attacks, big or small, anything can happen. Same thing goes for online voting too. It's been in use for a long time. The systems that have been in use historically, when challenged, when they go through their security audits, they typically don't hold up. And the excuse has been that even from the CSE, the government's, the security establishment themselves, their statement was simply, well, no one's hacking these small towns, so therefore we don't have the same security requirements. And we disagree 100%.
Of course.
It's only a thing because it's not a thing, or it's not a thing because it's not a thing right now. If you are at the end of the day holding the bag and your election is hacked and your voters are like, what just happened? You're gonna have big problems. In fact, in 2018, we saw 51 cities across Ontario go offline during their election using an online voting service, simply because of a configuration issue with the co-location server. A vendor had an issue, they didn't catch it right away, and 51 cities had to postpone their election by at least a day because of this disturbance. And as another vendor, as a competing vendor, our concern was that this was going to reflect on the industry as a whole, and so and so. And luckily, it wasn't significant enough to sort of warrant people to move back from online voting. At the same time, though, you do want to sort of mitigate against the public perception that online voting is not safe, or it can go offline, or it can be hacked, etc. So there's a lot of this thing is the most interdisciplinary compacting market I've ever seen. Like, you have so many stakeholders, so many different perspectives on it that need to be addressed. It's fun, it's super engaging to be part of. At the same time too, you do, like you said, have to take part of you have to take count of the voters, the election administrators, the media, candidates, just a whole number of stakeholders and that need to be addressed to bring this thing to market.
So that also apply to my IT industry as well, what you just mentioned. We can build the perfect system, we can design system very securely, and we can execute it the way it need to be. But how do you avoid human errors? Where somebody makes some mistakes, right? So how do you get a handle on that? Even the systems are perfect, everything's sorted out, everything tested. But the day the voting happened, how do you avoid human errors? Humans always going to be, people always going to be involved in that. They also need to be trained. So how do you avoid that? That's where I think a little bit of trick comes in, right?
I think for cybersecurity, what's the old saying? I think we all say it. The biggest vulnerability is sitting between the chair and the keyboard, right? It's inherent as part of the system. I think there's two major shifts happening, which we're really happy to see. And generally, the academics and the researchers will agree with this. Is one, up till now, most online providers, not even online providers, almost all election providers have been black box systems. They're closed source. They don't let anyone review the code unless absolutely necessary. And what that's produced is systems that, when they actually go through thorough testing, completely fall down. And we've actually seen major companies in the online voting space go bankrupt because when their system was reviewed and audited, the source code itself was deficient, and the contracts were pulled, and that was it. We're seeing more open source technology, open source approach applied to this market, which is fantastic. The other thing that we're seeing is standards starting to be adopted. So in Ontario particularly, there is a number of significant academics who have been working quite diligently for a long time at developing standards. And that's another component of this, which people aren't typically familiar with. If you pass a transaction online, you buy something online using a credit card, there is a whole regulatory body underneath all of that transaction that assesses, is the vendor, is the transaction secured, etc. But we don't have those same applications for online voting. There is nothing at all stopping me from building a website tomorrow using zero encryption and selling that to the city of Toronto. If they purchase it, there is nobody to come in and say you can't do this or it's not secure, etc. There is zero standards of regulations in this industry. And these academics and researchers have been working to move forward standards bodies, and it's actually going forward right now through the CIO Strategy Council. It's brought together the industry in a really unique way because people are now having this discussion. And that's one of the biggest shifts that we're seeing, and we're really happy to see that. So again, the open source technology application, I think, is phenomenal. And the fact that we're actually trying to build in some regulatory oversight into this industry is another huge thing that we haven't seen before.
Yeah, financial industry has a lot of regulation. Before you do a financial transaction, there's a payment houses that clear that transaction, make sure that it's that it's a credit or it's a viable transaction. So they go through the checks and balances. I'm so surprised that there's no body or there's no regulations on this industry where the voting is more critical than anything else you can think of.
Yeah, it's just one of those things that everyone kind of overlooks. So like the reason why Ontario is sort of ground zero for online voting is in the legislation. So years ago in the 90s, before it doesn't even say online voting, it just says alternative voting methods. So anything including alternative voting methods. So we have telephone voting up here. Telephone voting, you can't secure it. It's impossible to secure because you're just it's just you're passing. It's a IVR system. It's like calling a TELUS or something like that. You can't secure it, but they allow it. In fact, like municipalities will still use telephone voting. We had a conversation about telephone voting with some people, and we were trying to decide if telephone voting was considered online voting because technically speaking, it uses the network. And when I was thinking about the security applications behind that, my opinion was that if we tried to regulate telephone voting with some sort of even the bare minimum of security, nothing would pass because it's impossible to secure. But they allow it in Ontario, and that's how online voting got a foothold in this province. Was there was this open-ended piece of legislation, and in Ontario, again, due to the size, I think it originally started, from what I understand. I was very young back then, but in the early 2000s. Because people have cottages outside of the city, they are allowed to vote in both of those districts because they own property. So in those very far away, districts outside of the cities, how do you vote? You can't go in to vote. So things like vote by mail became a thing, and then somebody decided to offer online voting services, and that's how it kind of emerged. And then all of a sudden, it started picking up traction. And over 20 years, we now are at the point where we're looking at potentially provincial level online voting in a very short period of time. It's really unique, but at the same time, due to the sort of grassroots initiation of this market here in Ontario, nobody thought about, hey, maybe we should put a body behind this and try to figure out how to regulate it, because it wasn't a thing until it became something. Yeah. Interesting.
So talk about how's acceptance been? I know you're talking about some municipalities that are accepting it, some still in a process. Federally it's the same process, but where it's been accepted, I would assume that there's a lot of voting happening in the academic area, whereas the universities and colleges and schools are they more accepting online voting compared to federals, and where you see that the state of acceptance of these kind of voting?
I think, within my personal opinion, we're at the precipice of pretty much a rapid shift that's going to be occurring. Like you said, universities have been doing it for a long time already. Homeowners association, shareholders meetings, leadership conventions. So like the Liberals, the Conservatives, the UCP in Alberta, they all nominate themselves using online voting. Now, because of COVID this year, the parliamentarians, the MPs in Ottawa, are voting using an online system. So like they're casting their votes online. So it's hard for them to now say online voting is not acceptable for the public to use, but we're allowed to essentially enact laws with an online system. So like the challenges are very quickly being eradicated because it's becoming adopted in a number of different ways. And due to the companies like Microsoft, companies like Apple, Tim Cook making a statement recently about how he supports online voting as well, we're seeing a very sort of a paradigm shift in how people are perceiving this technology, and we expect the market to very quickly open up. There's countries that are now looking at this. We were happy to take part in an initiative in Brazil in November The Brazilian government invited us down to demo our system for their election in Sao Paulo. And so Brazil is a huge democratic country. They have a huge election initiative. They have a very customized voting system for the population of Brazil. And for them to start looking at adopting online voting is a huge thing as well. Switzerland is another country. They do very frequent voting due to their canton system and their referendum style voting. They've been looking at online voting for a number of years now. It's already actually been in use for a number of years, but they're actually looking at federalizing the online voting system for the entire country in a very short period of time. There's some members of the Canadian academic community that I believe are part of the panel now to sort of look into the system that they're building and certify it and make their comments about it. So it's really interesting.
Interesting. Where we are with that, it looks like we can have election this year in Canada, 2021. Where we are in a federally, you think they will be using some of the electronic, the voting, or is it still going to be paper based? What are your thoughts on the election coming up?
Elections Canada. If any of my colleagues see this interview, they laugh as soon as I smell. Elections Canada is inherently opposed to any change in the election system for a good reason. Elections Canada, if you ever see this, any member of Elections Canada, 100% I understand. We've tried to engage Elections Canada in a number of different ways. They're opposed to it, but the responsibility of a federal election is not a small undertaking, especially for a country like Canada. We're a brother to the US. We have a close relationship with US politics. So I understand where they're coming from when they say we don't want to introduce anything new. Elections Canada will be the last barrier to cross, I think. I think that's going to be generally the case for a lot of things. The high level government, like federal or state level, is going to be probably one of the last hurdles to cross. With that being said, though, one thing that my company has been quite keen on researching is the point that you mentioned earlier about the public perception of online voting. So whereas we may not be able to vote online at a federal level, my company is getting involved in the federal level election to provide information and services, very similar to what we were doing in the original project in 2015, because there is some benefit, and we do want to get people familiar and get them, I guess, informed that, look, online voting is available, maybe not at the federal level, but in different provinces at the municipal level across Canada. This is quickly becoming a thing, and it's time people started having that sort of public discussion about what happens when this technology is brought to the mass market for mass adoption.
I see. Interesting. Yeah, elections looks like coming very soon, but the hesitation may not be able to vote with devices even in a COVID. That's a challenge. Nobody wants to go out and vote in a COVID. I'm not sure how they can handle that. But by the time maybe a little bit more stress relief than a COVID side. So your organization, Neuvote, where are we heading? Where you see in the next coming years, Matthew? And where are you guys going? How are you guys planning? How big the growth you guys are looking for in your company?
Yeah, well, right now we're engaged in the procurement market for Ontario. We've seen the very beginning of the RFP start coming out. We're expecting quite a number of them to come out over the next 6 to 8 months. The municipalities have until May 2022 to decide on what they want to do. So it's right now, this is, like I said, ground zero for the market. This is pretty much every company in the world that provides online voting is engaged. We're here and we're all battling each other. It's quite invigorating, I guess would be the right word. It's really interesting to see. For my organization, we're focusing on providing optimum services for the Canadian market, but also looking at the US and how to figure out the best way to start bringing this sort of technology down there. The US, of course, world's biggest democracy. Well, actually, not India is the world's biggest.
India is the biggest one in population.
Yeah, no, 100%. I actually, funny enough, India, I believe, is running some pilots for online voting. In a very limited capacity.
They did in the last election, and there were so many claims for the fraud in those votings. Not in a software, but in a hardware itself. So there's been so many claims. I think I'm not sure what they're going to do in this election. So that's what happened in the last election. So in population-wise, they're probably one of the biggest in a democracy, over 1.5 billion people.
Oh yeah, India is the largest per capita. What I meant to say was the U.S. is the largest like revenue generating democracy. The money that goes down there to facilitate elections is completely off the charts compared to Canada.
Mm-hmm.
The federal election in Canada, I believe, fluctuates around $500 million. That's a pittance to what the U.S. spends on both campaigning and actually facilitating the election. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
So we're looking at the U.S. The U.S. is very much opposed to the idea of online voting, not at the public perception level necessarily, but from the experts and election official community. They are very much like, we like paper, we want to keep things on paper. But again, the US is also the biggest pain point. In Canada, the difficulty voting is completely fractional compared to what the experience of a general voter is in a place like the southern US or something like that, where you're waiting in line for quite a long time. Voting laws are rapidly shifting and changing, year by year. So figuring out how to best bring a better service down to the US, I think, is going to be our focus leading up to 2023. And we're following up on some global stuff that we've been working on. So it's when I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation how my background was, to be a journalist and kind of apply that cybersecurity principles to journalism. That was only half of it. Part of my big, dream was to travel around, which is why I kind of fell into journalism. Luckily for myself, elections are happening all over the world, and this industry has provided me the ability to travel and meet really, really unique and amazing people across the world and see how democracy flourishes globally. It's really a great experience.
Wow, lot to learn. So how about countries? When you go from one country to another country trying to provide a service, do they scrutinize your validation system more differently with their laws and regulation, or is it the same kind of process when it comes to technology? Do they have a separate laws they can scrutinize this way, or some another country is going to scrutinize your validation system differently, or is it just same standard IT technology process?
I think there's a general baseline of how people validate technology like IT systems, and I think like most services in government are IT connected at some point now. So there is a general understanding of how procurement should happen when it comes to IT. When it comes to voting, though, it's very different because, like you said, with India's election, it is very unique. The way that it's been managed prior to the online initiatives. India has a very unique voting system. Brazil, when we were down there, we had to pretty much build a custom voting system for Brazil because it's Brazil. I think the India system, if I'm not mistaken, is basically configured to be illiterate capable. You don't need to have any. Yeah, it's not
just lights. Different colors of light. You just pick which one.
Brazil's the same way too. They have essentially a touchpad system because you have such high illiteracy in the large number of the population that having something like we have up here where you have to read a bunch of stuff isn't possible. It's not feasible. So Brazil had a bespoke system, India, and then you have places like the US and Canada with their own version of it. But the way that the government is procuring these systems is quickly shifting. So the US has a federal agency in charge of elections. It's called the EAC, Electoral Assistance Commission. They're the ones who certify election systems. They haven't certified an online voting system to date, but they are looking at building in the parameters to do so at this time. Canada, funny enough, does not have a federal agency for all of the elections as we do as they do in the US. The Canada, it's like you have municipal, provincial, and then federal level ones where things can change. Like I said, municipal level in Ontario, do whatever you want. Provincially in Ontario, completely different ballgame. It's completely different parameters of procurement. Elections Canada, again, super very bespoke how they provide how they procure their services. Then you have other countries like that are sort of leading the path right now. So you have a country like Switzerland, as I mentioned, who has developed a certification type body that they are now forming and essentially working through the kinks out on how do you initiate and instantiate a voting system at the federal level. What sort of steps need to go through? Does a vendor or a procurement thing need to go through to provide this service? What sort of testing, what sort of review, source code review, public penetration testing, etc. So I think we're starting to really see globally the beginnings of this sort of self-regulatory bodies being formed. And then what that looks like down the road, I couldn't tell you, but I will imagine, or my opinion is sort of, at some point in time, we're going to have something like PCI compliance for voting. It's just going to be, it'll be in use enough times, people will be more comfortable with it, that you will have a general technical requirements document that people can follow. Even if you're not a technically apt, government worker, you should be able to pick up something, a piece of paper or a document, and say, this is what, the 10 things that a vendor needs to be able to do for us to be able to adopt this system. Once we have that more streamlined, I think you'll see this stuff pick up pretty much across the world, just from the convenience of the voter, but also the cost reduction that online voting can bring. It's simple. The simple math is, it's a lot easier to have people vote remotely than travel to a location, rent a location, manage all of the services, all the maintenance of machines, et cetera. There's a ton of cost associated with running like an in-person election. Online voting has always been, proposed as this massive cost saver. And I do believe that once it becomes, picks up a little bit more critical mass adoption, we're going to see general cost savings for governments across the board.
Yeah, definitely. When you're running election, look how many people you're hiring. It's a big, overhaul taking. All the buildings and all the people. Definitely, if you can work from home, definitely. I don't think you can compare even cost. It's totally, totally different ballgame with the cost side of things.
Funny side note to that is, and this is one of the unspoken realities that the election officials are seeing. Who volunteers for elections? Like typically, it's almost, and again, it's almost completely people who are older, because they are the ones who are passionate about it. They have they want to get involved. It's like a very high percentage of people that are retired, or they have some extra time or something. What happens when those people are no longer available to volunteer? And so that is we've spoken with cities and we've spoken with election agencies where that is a major concern for them, is if we can't staff the election, or if we don't have people appropriate to staff the election with, what do you do? Like, you really have to start thinking of alternatives in that regard. The easy, I already can, I'm a little bit biased. I already know the easy answer, but I think that's a question that election officials are going to have to figure out and ask themselves. No,
I can talk about personal experience. I was in a municipality, and when every time there was election, they will send email out, who wants to volunteer the night towards election, this community center, and they were always short of people. They wouldn't have enough people to come out and support. So they will simply say, okay, we have to mandate who needs to come out. So they will take employees and give them a day off and take them, and you have to work towards the evening to run the election. So all IT staff had to volunteer. There was no choice. No choice. If you got 70, 80 of people in the IT department, they all had to work those nights, and not enough doing any IT work, but doing a volunteer work in a community centers where you're counting votes and you're doing all this stuff.
That's crazy. Yeah.
They just couldn't find enough people to do that.
I know colleagues of mine that volunteer they want to get the experience of seeing how the elections are actually ran. So they're typically on the younger side, and they're like, oh man, it's almost primarily older people. And then the other consideration is, when they're staffing these things, they pay the volunteers for their time, but they have to over forecast how many volunteers are going to just not even show up, even though they're getting paid. So we were talking to one city, and they said, we typically, not a huge city, but they said we typically have to hire around 550 volunteers, because we already know 150 of those people are not even going to show up come election day. They just won't answer their phone. They won't show up. There's no penalty. Like, what are they going to do? Right? It's like, you can't get fired from a volunteer job. These are the things that we kind of have to face head on down the road. And what do our elections look like when democracy itself is taking a different form? I think it's really interesting.
It's changing time, definitely. And you talk about the risk. I mean, that's one of the risks. They have to consider when you have a paper votes that people may not show up. So when you compare those risks, definitely makes sense. You have to just be mindful that technology is more scrutinized, but where's the more risk are? Right? At least about people risk and the technology side.
There's a really interesting case study from the Netherlands. The Netherlands had voting machines from going back to the 60s. These big, huge machines. A ballot in the Netherlands is like the size of a wall. It's huge. Mm-hmm. And all of the candidates are listed, and you just go through and you make selections. And anyway, long story short, the machines were hacked and proven to be hackable in a very significant way. So they got rid of everything. This is recently, within the last 20 years. They deprecated the entire system. They went right back to paper ballots, these giant paper ballots. But the Netherlands, again, like how they run their elections, they count everything by hand. They decided to not include any electronic component into their elections. So after the election concludes in the Netherlands, they hand count those paper ballots. And part of the challenge is, from a volunteer's point of view, you wake up in the morning, you show up, you volunteer all day, and then you can't leave until those ballots are counted. Anybody that has worked an overnight shift or something will tell you, come 3 o'clock in the morning or something,
making mistakes.
You're making mistakes. You're tired, right? And it's like we said earlier, the human error component. If we were to rely on this sort of paper, because it works, and human counting and all this other stuff, what happens when people start making mistakes? Where's the redundancy? Where's the failover that would occur from a security perspective in these inherent systems? And it's just one of the other things that we need to consider, right? Like, it's great to hand count a paper ballot for an assurance. It's paper, it's humans, like handling everything. The chain of custody is significant. Humans make errors just as much as a computer does. In fact, the humans are the ones designing the computer system. So inherently, like, everything needs to be checked multiple times. I'm very much a proponent of hybrid methodology, using the best of both human capability, but also technology capabilities to really create a system that works in general practice, not just individually.
Yeah, interesting. You mentioned that human. Yeah, definitely. There's more room for people working a longer shift making mistakes. That technology is not going to make those mistakes. It doesn't matter what time of the day, it's just going to work. If it works once, it's going to work all the time.
The 2020 election in the U.S. In Georgia, millions of ballots, very high populated state. They ran the recount through machines after machine after machine to get the final vote, and then they counted it by hand, by humans at the end of it, again for another count. I think that works because you're combining the human and the technology side. I wouldn't rely on either one of those things, especially for something where it was like mission critical. It was going to essentially determine the path the U.S. went down in that particular state. I think looking at things holistically and figuring out where the best patches can be made is probably the best course of action. And that's something we've always said, like Neuvote has always said since the very beginning, where it's not going to be us designing a software solution, throwing it up there and calling it a day. It's a constant revision. It's a constant struggle to figure out where we can best bring together, different complementary technologies or services or strategies to build something that really, really works. And my forecast for the elections is that's how it's going to be. It's going to be a combination of what has worked before, what works best now, and what's going to work best in the future, and whatever we need to do to bring these things together. Because anybody who's read one of these procurement documents from even a smaller municipality realizes it's not a small undertaking to deploy these systems. Elections are very, very unique instances of both a combination of IT requirements, democratic requirements, and then the voters' experience that need to come together and culminate in a successful election. It's going to be the exact same thing for any sort of online voting system. And to be honest, I think that's where this industry has really struggled, is the engineering sort of methodology of, oh, you know what, we can just make voting simpler, put it on a web page and call it a day. That simplicity and low expectation is what's frustrated this industry, because as soon as we start applying that very simple-minded approach to something as complex as an election, that's where things start falling apart. This was it's very difficult. Like we said at the beginning, it's very difficult to pull off, but at the same time, it's very needed.
Interesting. So I know we're running a little bit longer than time, but I wanted to ask you your opinion on one more item before we go. You saw in the U.S. over the last few years, digital currencies, bitcoins or cryptos and all that stuff, it roots from the same technology, encrypted, crypto encryption, it's based on the same thing. There's a lot been going on in the US where decentralizing anything is seems like is getting a lot of momentum. So currency is one of those things that the banks had a control. Now they're trying to nobody owns currency. It just out in the public. Now they're trying to move that to social media the same way. So Facebook's not owned by one vendor, or social media is not owned by a vendor. They're thinking maybe social media has to be nobody has a control over it, same as a crypto, right? So you see any movement in elections as well that not private company owns it. It's just out in the public owns it. Same technology applied to these systems as well. Or you see a more value when one private company controls it, they make sure the technology is right and they move in the right direction.
So it's an interesting question. So like, I'll answer it in a couple of ways. So first off, blockchain has always been touted as like a solution to a number of different things. Mm-hmm. But when you try to apply it to voting, it's never worked. And we've looked into it. It's not like I'm discounting it because I don't like the technology. I think the crypto space is amazing and it provides a ton of value for a number of different things. The challenge is if you go back to the original white paper from Satoshi Nakamoto, when he wrote the benefits of Bitcoin, mm-hmm. you have a decentralized system where the whole thing is ideally supposed to be transparent. Yeah. The second that you centralize that or privatize that network, you lose all the benefits of the transparency of the decentralized network itself. The challenge that when you try to apply that blockchain decentralization methodology to voting is you get into issues like really simply like the 51% attack. So you have a decentralized node network. If 51% of that node agrees that the answer is X, but the answer is really Y, but you're just sort of overpowering it by consensus. So that was the first vulnerability that was really exposed why blockchain wasn't really fitting to voting in a very applicable way. Mm-hmm. The other aspect of it is too, though, you get into real issues with privacy and the voting secrecy component. So yeah. In a blockchain, I can see that John made a payment to Sue. It's logged on the network or something. It's very similar to like the Tor network in that instance, whereas you have an endpoint an entry point and an endpoint. Blockchain is similar to that. You have an instance. It's logged. It's transparent. Everyone can see it. That's the whole benefit of having this decentralization. For voting, though, you don't want to know that John voted for Sue. Yeah. You want to keep that private. Mm-hmm. The ideal is it's completely anonymous, which is why we have the secret ballot, which is like it's on paper. It goes into a box with other pieces of paper. The box is shuffled in some way, and no one knows whose vote actually went to who, but we know that the voter was verified, the vote occurred, and the vote was deposited securely into the ballot box. Mm-hmm. That process needs to be maintained, and blockchain can provide similarities to that. But the challenge is again, going back to the technology application, the second that a vulnerability is exposed on a decentralized network where we can identify John and we can identify through multiple of different ways, timestamps, for example, different markers or indicators that would reveal someone's identity, the whole thing falls apart. And to use the US as an example, there's a lot of discontent down there politically right now. Mm-hmm. Imagine if a list was produced of everyone who voted for Trump or Biden, and that was then publicized. This is the vulnerability that plays a real big role in how people view online voting. Because if this public list was made available to everyone, even if it was like a state actor just releasing it to cause some confusion or whatever, people would freak out, mm-hmm. and you can't have that sort of application. My perspective is at some point in time, perhaps there's a protocol that emerges that really solves voting in a decentralized cryptographic manner that similar to what you consider a blockchain at these days. But that thing hasn't existed or it doesn't exist yet, and we haven't seen anything that would indicate that it would. The developers of Election Guard, the architect, Dr. Benelo, mm-hmm. he's so against blockchain voting that if you're on a meeting with him and you say the word blockchain and voting, you can visibly see his discontent on his face. And after listening to his expertise and why he doesn't believe it's a good fit, you start to get a better idea of why we haven't seen a blockchain company really emerge and capitalize on this. We've seen them come out. There's a number of them that are operating, but they haven't really had any success. And it goes back to that first main issue. They're not decentralized. They can't. And the CEOs of the company will tell you themselves, oh, we can't have a decentralized blockchain. It's a private node network. But then it go back to the white paper. We'll say you're running a private node network that you control. Well, then how is that transparent? How is that decentralized? It's the same thing that I'm running on my server, except instead of having like one cloud environment, you have 12 cloud environments that are all talking to each other. It's the same thing though, really. You just, in fact, I would say you've added complexity to it rather than removed complexity. So yeah, it's unfortunate. We were a big believer in crypto space. I am involved in the crypto space myself. My engineers I work with are involved in the crypto space. We think it's great technology. It just, I don't know if it's ever going to work for voting. Maybe one day.
Maybe need more time. The time will tell, how far they go. If they can sort out financial market, maybe they have a more room to play with that.
Yeah, everyone makes that analogy, like, hey, we can pay for things online. Why can't we vote online? But again, it's like, if the bank sends me a wrong transaction, they can reverse it. You cannot reverse a vote. If you can reverse a vote, things have really, really gone left field on you.
You already lost that, legitimacy of the votes. Interesting. Yeah, thank you. I learned so much from our discussion. Definitely, I think the people who are watching, they will draw a great value from our discussion, Matthew. Where can people find you? Where can they connect with you if they want to learn more about online voting or a Neuvote? How can they connect with you? How can they reach you?
Neuvote.com, NEUVOT. I have it on the website there.
Nice.
Matthew@neuvote.com if you want to send me an email. Love to discuss this with people and get involved. And we're pushing forward to get involved in the communities across Canada right now. So anybody who can provide value or wants to work with us in some capacity, reach out. I'd love to talk to you.
Yeah, we send out this video in an email format to a lot of our contacts. So I'll definitely make sure I include your email and your website in an email as well. And the people can click a link and they can reach out to you. I will definitely, it just awareness is that, that's where you're going to need a lot more help getting the message out, getting a communication out. More people reach out to you, more they connect with you. Definitely, they'll learn more about the online voting.
Sounds great. Again, Gurmeet, it was an absolute pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your time, Matthew.
Have a great day.
You too. Have a good one.